Welcome back to the Tennis Doctors, where three physicians talk about the world of men's professional tennis. Joining me, as always, I'm Jay Sridhar. I got Dr. Bilal Ahmed
Hey, good to be back again.
and Arjun Watani.
Hey there, let's do it.
So we're going to start a series. So between big events, big slams, we're going to talk about old matches that are rewatchable. And there are a ton of old matches you can look at. If you have requests, you can always throw them in the comments. But basically, I like to pick matches that are relevant to sort of today's game. So, we could dig in the 90s and go pre-poly. We could go back to wooden rackets. It's great for posterity, but it's really just about how can we connect this in between our conversations about what's happening today in men's tennis? Can we find some connections? And how does it tie into legacy and sort of the discussion that's going around Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer in the slam race? So we picked US Open Final 2007, Djokovic, Federer. Background for this match before we dive into it. So first of all, how did they get there, right? What was the trajectory? Djokovic was 20 at the time, Federer 26 at that point. Very different pedigrees heading into this match. This was Djokovic's first slam final, but he had a banner year. He had lost to Federer, fourth round of Australian Open. He had lost again to Nadal in the semis of the French. And then he made the semis at Wimbledon, lost to Nadal there. He retired. But his big breakthroughs that year, he reached the final in Indian Wells, lost to Nadal, beat Nadal in Miami, won the Miami Open as his first Masters 1000 title. And of course, he's the record holder now. And then the American hardcourt season, beat Nadal and Federer back-to-back matches, semi and final, Roddick in the quarters to win Montreal. Match that's sort of ties a little bit into what we're going to talk about in this match, because that match against Federer was a classic Djokovic-Federer match where Djokovic won 2 tie breaks and lost the middle set 6-2. And then in this individual tournament, what about Federer? Federer is coming in. He's the 3-time defending champ. He's going to go ahead, I think, and win, I believe, his 10th or 11th. This is up there for slams. 12 slams. Sorry. He was 11 hitting 12 slams at this point. Heavy favorite in this match, but had dropped a couple sets on the way. So their runs to the final, Djokovic has an epic 5-setter with Roddick Stepanek in the second round. He loses a set to Juan Monaco in the round 4, but otherwise has pretty clear sailings. He has kind of an easy draw. The draw really broke well for him. So he had the quarters against Carlos Moya, who was kind of past his prime at that point. David Ferrer in his first Grand Slam semi was a straight set match. Nadal was in that half, lost to Ferrer. But we're going to talk about his form in this match. He was looking good. I mean, he had a good hardcourt season overall. Federer rolled through a lot of his draw, but again, there were some hiccups. Lost to John Isner in his first Grand Slam tournament, tiebreak in the first set. Lost the first set to Feliciano Lopez, but just steamrolled Roddick and Davydenko to get to this final. And the head-to-head, before we dive into the match, what's the head-to-head to coming into this match? Federer at this point has lost just the one match in Montreal, but has beaten Djokovic. He has beaten him in Monte Carlo the year before. He has beaten him at the Australian Open, which is a match relevant to this one. Steamrolled him in Australia in 3 sets. And then also took care of him in Dubai, where there was a closer match in Dubai. And then there's the Montreal match right before this. But, if you go back to that head-to-head, Djokovic did take a set, even at age 17, off of Federer and Clay in 2006. Pushed him in Dubai. And even though the Australian Open match was 3 sets, there are some signs that this guy can trouble him, and obviously beat him in Montreal. So let's dive into this match. So we're not going to go through the specifics of what happened at individual points. I just want to use this, Arjun, as kind of just a holistic sort of, let's talk about these guys and what you noticed. My first question, Arjun, did you watch this match live? And my question is, watching this match now, whether you watched it live or not, what surprised you the most about each player? Like, was there anything about each player that you're like, oh, wow, I forgot about X?
Yeah, so I watched this match. I was in 7th grade. I remember it was like the fall of 7th grade, and people were coming up to me the next day like, who's Djokovic? Who's Djokovic? And I think, honestly, it must have been one of the first times I'd watched Djokovic that year. Kind of kept my focus on Nadal and Federer at that young age, and didn't really mind anyone who was up and coming per se. But at that time, I just remember this young kid who's breaking into the scene and troubling Federer here, but Federer got it done in 3 sets, and I never really thought for another minute that he would be such a force. A few months later in the Australian Open, he actually went on to win the next tournament, the Australian Open, without dropping a set in 2008.
Dropped one set in the final, the first set in the final. But yeah, he beat
Oh.
Federer in straights in that one. Otherwise,
Yeah,
didn't lose
got
just that. That's correct.
Okay, that's right. So then fast forward a few years later, and he's dominating the game, dominating more than Federer did. And at that point, Federer, like we said, had 12 Grand Slams, 11 Grand Slams, going for his 12th, and Djokovic just kind of looked inexperienced almost at this stage. He was really running the match in cruise control. Federer was kind of running the match in cruise control, kind of like how Djokovic is now against people like Cam Norrie and Sinner in the last 3 sets in Wimbledon, and then even against quite a few rounds this tournament when people pushed him by Kyrgios winning the first set, and then Djokovic just played his game. So, I mean, compared to now, you see a much more experienced veteran Djokovic who doesn't, if he's up 40 love now, he's gonna win the game. And but like back then, Djokovic was up 40 love on Federer's serve and lost those opportunities, or vice versa. Federer came back and hit like amazing returns, of course, but drew a lot of unforced errors from Djokovic's end. So you definitely see that he's troubling Federer at 20 years old. But the biggest difference that we're seeing right now between him and someone like FAA is that Djokovic actually learned from his mistakes and matured over those years, and like is taking his game to a next level. And like from one tournament to the next, the finals of US Open to the finals of Australian Open. And so I guess what I've taken away in comparing the two is what he learned over the years and how mentally stable he became. It's not like his game is very similar to then. His drop shots are much better now than it looked like in the highlights, but he really learned from that match, and I think improved and took serious lessons from there.
Great summary. It's funny, Bilal, because I think there's always hindsight bias and that's why I think it's so interesting to hear so Arjun's kind of coming from the perspective, he's like, Djokovic wasn't that good yet mentally, like he wasn't tight.
Yeah.
There was definitely these drop-offs, similar to Kyrgios blowing that 40 love, for example. Did you blow it, or did the other guy just put pressure on you? Mm-hmm. For me, and maybe it's because I'm coming from the place, Bilal, where let's focus on Djokovic first of all. What impressed me? We'll go to Federer in a second. I was watching this. I watched this live too, and I was just like, I forgot how good Djokovic was at 20. Yeah. And they flashed that little thing. They're like, oh, he's the youngest finalist at the U.S. Open since Pete Sampras. I mean, like stuff like that. You're like, wow, like the pedigree was there. Like we all should have been. I mean, people are shocked, I think, because he had that lull for a little bit before he really took off. Mm-hmm. But all the signs are there. I mean, for me, like these are the notes I took down. I don't know if you have anything to add. I was like, number one, he's better at net than I remember him being. I mean, I think one of the knocks on him was like, oh, he's not that good at net. I compare him to some of the guys now we'll talk about. He's way better at net than a lot of the younger guys. Yeah. He, at that age, is already getting a ton of returns in play. Mm-hmm. A lot of these stab returns. He breaks Federer in the first set. It's basically Federer misses a forehand put away, but he gets a return back that probably 95% of the tour is not getting that ball back in play. And Federer, misses the return. That's what Djokovic does. He just makes you hit another ball. I think his footwork on the backhand is the other thing that really impressed me. You watch his backhand. It doesn't matter whether he's hitting it open stance or closed stance. His footwork is beautiful. And like, it's so funny to watch this because I have to separate. You have these years of fandom where you sort of just like, I root against this guy. Mm-hmm. You have to appreciate at 20, his footwork on the backhand. Clearly, we'll talk about later. I think Carlos Alcaraz's backhand is very modeled on this Djokovic backhand. Very compact. Mm-hmm. Very, very clean. And then the final thing I would say, he's very odd. They talk about his forehand a lot in this match, how big it is. And he can really hit the forehand big. I don't think we talk about his forehand as a big weapon. Even then, it's kind of an awkward, odd looking forehand. He always looks a little bit off balance, but it's effective. It always seems to go where he wants it to go. It seems to drop in the court. He doesn't make a lot of mistakes with it. I guess my takeaway was, I'm like, wow, people talk about this guy not being in his prime yet. And this goes back to what Will Blumberg was saying in the last episode. Margins are really slim. This guy is there. I mean, this guy is clearly got it. And maybe we all missed the boat being like, well, this guy could be the next great big thing. Everything was there that has made him great now.
Yeah. And right before Bilal goes, I just have one more stat to add that I found really, really interesting. And it kind of speaks to his inexperience at that age. You just spoke really well about what he has, and he's right there. The thing he didn't have, though, at that time was the closing factor. He couldn't close things. So one stat that I found was Djokovic had 28 game points on his serve and only won 14 of them. So that means like if it was add in, then it went back to deuce, or 40 love, it became 40-15. So he won half of his game points. On the other hand, Federer at that time had 18 game points and won 15 of them. So he's closing games, closing big moments. Federer knows knew he's a veteran at that point. Like already at 26, he's a veteran, and knows how to play those big points and knows how to close and win those. And I think that probably one of those big moment tennis strategies really carried Federer over the edge there than Djokovic did.
Bilal, comments on Djokovic technically, or again, what Arjun's talking about, like the point kind of important points.
Yeah, I think one thing I didn't appreciate, well, I watched this when I was also in 7th grade. I remember, same as Arjun. I remember I was at a friend's house, and this is like my peak Federer fandom age. And I think I didn't realize until I rewatched these highlights how actually, like you said, how close this match really was. The first set, I did not realize that Djokovic actually had that many opportunities to take it, and the second set. So it is interesting to think about what could have been in a world like that if he had had a 2 sets to love lead. In terms of technical things, though, I think it is kind of to your point. There are things that definitely were strengths that I think are not appreciated, especially when we look at players today, especially the younger ones like an Alcaraz or Sinner. That Djokovic does do so well. But additionally, I thought that what's interesting is, like you said, the balance issue. I felt like the backhand balance has always been stronger, but the forehand was so like it felt like recovery off the forehand side to getting back to the middle of the court. You could tell that he was not as comfortable doing that yet, which is fair. Other things, though, I felt like the serve motions, obviously, this is like pre his whole serve adjustment, kicking the shoulder back lower a little bit than usual.
Yeah.
But
he's still got a good serve, though. His serve is better than Alcaraz or Sinner right now.
Yeah, and even speed wise, I mean, his power is there. I mean, he's hitting like 120 average, which is respectable for at that level. But I thought that one thing is mentally, I know he wasn't closing yet per se, but I felt like for him to push the second set to also have opportunities, and the third was only one break essentially.
Right.
So
he didn't go away.
He didn't go away, and I think that actually spoke a lot more and kind of showed that what was to come, especially in Australia just a few months later. So I think it was writing on the wall that this guy is going to be a force. And I think Federer was obviously happy with the win, but kind of deep down, you're like, okay, this guy's not going anywhere.
You have to think a little bit about, and we'll talk about the aftermath of this, but I guess people did think after this match that he was coming, and then he did win the Aussie Open. And I think a lot of people were like, he's the next guy. Nadal's sliding away because Nadal hadn't won anything since the French. Mm-hmm. And then we'll talk a little bit aftermath. That 2008 clay season, it was Nadal just holding Djokovic off the whole season from getting the number 2 spot. Djokovic was knocking on that wall. And I think Djokovic kept losing to Nadal, and it mentally messed him up a little bit. He lost early at Wimbledon. And then he was kind of on and off. People talk about the gluten and this and that and the stamina. And obviously things changed for him at some point. But I also just think it was really hard for him to break through with Nadal on clay and Federer on hard courts. And then he was still figuring out how to play on grass. What about the other thing about him? Even though I think he's better even in this match moving side to side, and that's one of his strengths now, he's a little worse, especially in the forehand wing, if you put him in diagonals. If he has to cut off a diagonal, he's great on the backhand about coming and either cutting a backhand off short, taking it early. The forehand, he can be off balance. But side to side, he's great at putting away short balls. And Medvedev at this year's Australian Open, that was like a big problem. Nadal was just like, hey, I'm going to give you a bunch of short balls. Djokovic had no problem hitting an approach shot, coming in, finishing the point. What about Federer, Bilal? So for Federer, obviously, he's one of your favorite player. It's hard because we watched him continuously all those years. It's like when you see a friend and you see him every single year, you don't really realize they're getting older, right?
Yeah.
What stood out to you about Federer in this match that you didn't surprise you or you didn't remember?
Well, the thing is that this is 100% peak Federer. I think that's what's also really interesting is that to me, this is Djokovic taking on Federer probably at his prime. I felt like the forehand was it's so funny because then you never think of Federer as a guy who lacks confidence, but I think in these later years I can see, especially now, the forehand, not only because of decline for physical reasons, part of age, but just the confidence too. I mean, especially, set points down, for him to pull off a forehand down the line like he did on the first set, I thought was pretty, that's a statement of confidence. Movement wise, he was moving fluidly, I thought, as well back then, even on the hard courts. So I feel like this court actually suits him. I think people have said this in the past too, but this when the U.S. Open court is playing fast, it does suit him almost as well as Wimbledon on the grass. I mean, he takes advantage of that, and he breaks. He doesn't give players much rhythm. He moves faster and faster on serve, trying to end games quickly. So this was him trying to do that, and I felt like him kind of narrowing that gap and putting the pressure on Djokovic didn't really allow, like we said earlier, Djokovic to kind of close. I think Federer just had the confidence to know that I've been in this position more than this kid. No matter what he thinks about himself, I've been here before too, and I've already won this tournament 3 times in a row. So I thought this was more of the Federer sort of, how you could say, like the aura of Federer kind of overtaking more than Djokovic not playing well.
Well, I jotted some notes, Arjun, on top of what Bilal said. So one of the things I noted, and I think this is carried true throughout their history, and you saw Djokovic flipping the head-to-head as they got older. I think the most important shot in this matchup is Federer's backhand up the line.
Yep.
Because when he gets trapped in recent years, he can't take the backhand up the line. He doesn't have the confidence. He can't do it consistently because he's not early in it. He doesn't have the timing right. So he gets stuck in these backhand jail cross-court rallies where either Djokovic gets a weak reply and hits a backhand up the line first, or he just grinds him down. Djokovic can't grind with him in this match. Like that's one of the things Djokovic does make unforced errors. An aggressive position. He has to. He knows he has to be aggressive because if he hits a nothing ball in the middle of the court, the point is over. Federer just forehand ends the point. So he's got to hit sharp cross court. And the points in this match where Federer is hitting up the line, Djokovic is not prepared for that. He just has no answers for that. And it's kind of similar to the Djokovic-Nadal match. Yeah. When Nadal is hitting his forehand up the line on that cross court from the Djokovic backhand, Djokovic has never had answers for that. But he understands it's a lower percentage shot, so he's ultimately going to win a lot of those rallies.
Yeah.
Federer is so quick coming to the net in a couple of these. Like, it is lightning fast how quickly he cuts off something. Like, you forget how fast he was in terms of it's hard to separate because you're like, well, Djokovic's passing shots get better, so he's passing Federer more as he gets older. But part of it is Federer is hitting some ridiculous volleys on the dead run stretch. And then the final thing is in margins, right? He's getting a lot of these block and stab returns back that he's not getting in 4 or 5 years, right? And if I had to say the biggest difference, talk about legacy, is like between Federer in his prime versus Federer 2010, 11, 12, when he's sort of out of his prime, he's losing to Tsonga, he's losing to Berdych. He's losing these matches because he can't break enough. And part of the reason he can't break enough is he doesn't have these beautiful block stab returns that come back with a lot of pace, that are coming back deep and hard. He doesn't hit those as many anymore. He doesn't have the consistency on that. And that's why he can lose a match to Tsonga from 2 sets up, because he just can't break. That's how he can lose to Berdych at Wimbledon, because he can't break. That's how he can blow it 2 sets to love lead against Djokovic at the Open, because he can't get the breaks when he needs them. I think that's the most fascinating thing here, because that allows him to come back from 40 love down the first set, is he's getting returns in play, right? It's all about he's getting returns in play and getting into a point. I don't think he could come back from 40 love now in his last few years because he just can't get enough of those returns in play. So that, to me, that was the other thing I forgot, was how good a returner he was in terms of getting a lot of those tough serves back.
Yeah. So to add validation to your everything you just said, talking about Federer's greatness in this match, his serve, he actually served half his serves to the forehand and the other half to Djokovic's backhand. So he was going both ways, and Djokovic kind of had to guess which way to go. Djokovic, on the other hand, was serving 2/3 of his serves to Federer's backhand. Mm-hmm. And on this match, we were saying that Djokovic's backhand Federer's backhand was on fire with the down the lines across courts, and especially those jabs and those slices. It was really vintage Federer right here with his backhand. Federer was actually missing the majority of his forehands in terms of unforced errors. And finally, just talking about rallies, more than 70% of this match, their rallies were down the middle or cross courts. And kind of like you said, a lot of the balls coming to the middle, Federer was dominating those. And especially the short rallies, 1 to 3 shots, 1 to 4 shots, Federer won more than 55% of those. And any long points, Federer actually had the advantage. So 9 shots or more, Federer won over 63% of those points. So anywhere in the middle, then you knew it was Djokovic's point, just based on maybe a strong serve by him. But before short points, long points, Federer really had the advantage and really had a plan for every point there, especially the big points.
You know, those are phenomenal stats. And I think it also speaks to Djokovic's game plan wasn't bad. I mean, this is the other thing that's underrated about young Djokovic, young Nadal is young Nadal. I think Nadal gets a lot of credit for that. I think Djokovic doesn't get enough credit for that. I don't give enough credit for even as a young age. He was very smart. He knew how to win these matches, right? And so like his game plan wasn't wrong. He just didn't execute on the big points. Otherwise, he could have won this match, which is kind of crazy to think about beating prime Federer. 20-year-old Djokovic beats him at the Open easily. McEnroe said somewhere easily could have been 2 sets to love. Mm-hmm. You know, before we move on, you know, young players today take a lot of crap, Bilal. We give them a lot of crap. We're like, come on, just beat these guys. Like, they're so old. It's not the same as being 26-year-old Federer. But 20-year-old Djokovic probably would be able to beat 35 or 36-year-old Nadal or 35 or 36-year-old Djokovic. I mean, we would imagine. But maybe we got to give Djokovic again more credit here. He's a once in a generation talent. I think we're like, I was trying to think about comps. I was writing down, I'm like, okay, is Yannick Sinner like him? Like, well, his serve isn't as good, you know, and he doesn't have the net game. Is Alcaraz is the closest. Alcaraz's serve still isn't as good. And he tends to like, he's not as smart in terms of his shot selection sometimes. FAA's backhand's not as good, right? So like, there really isn't a comp. And I know Zverev and Medvedev get compared a lot to it, but Zverev can't hit his forehand like this.
No.
And Medvedev can't come to net and finish like Djokovic does. We just got to appreciate. I know a lot of people have tried to model their game this way. I just couldn't think of a young, because we are like Federer, there's no comparison. Nadal is super unique, no comparison. I don't know if there's a Djokovic comparison. When you even look at young Djokovic, I don't think we see a guy like that today.
The closest I can think of in terms of someone who has an all-around game is Alcaraz, but Alcaraz still, I mean, I'm excited about where he goes from here, but he still hasn't proven himself to this extent. I mean, Djokovic is 20 years old and is already, you know, winning. I mean, you could argue, yes, Alcaraz has won Masters. He's pushed the top 3. He's, you know, beaten Nadal and all that. He's been beating Djokovic, of course, as well. But I think I personally, and maybe a lot of others out there now, I think we overlooked that Djokovic was, as you said, 19, 20, you know, making the stage of a Grand Slam and really pushing hard and almost could have won. And Alcaraz is only a year away from that. Sinner's already 20, I believe. So, you know, I think I think we've kind of, we were kind of spoiled back then about young phenom talents, because that was a pretty broad generation. You had Nadal, obviously Djokovic, Murray, guys like Monfils, you know, Gasquet. People were excited about quite a few players in that generation who they thought would be the next big thing. And then we didn't really see anybody for quite some time with the big 3 dominating. So, you know, I think we're all, as tennis fans, actively trying to be excited about a new player. We're trying to find a new reason to find the next big guy, because we know the big 3 are kind of, you know, on the tail end of their career. So I don't know if there's anybody at this level who's comparative to Djokovic at this point, but I'd say maybe Alcaraz in terms of similarity of all-around game is pretty well balanced.
I'm a little more bullish on Alcaraz than you are. I feel like he's 19 years old, has a couple wins, big tournaments under his belt, and I think this environment right now in tennis is a lot harder than it was in 2006, 2007.
You think it's harder? I mean, he had to beat prime Federer to win the US Open if he wanted to win it.
So I think it was very top 3 heavy since then. But right now, I think the 3 to 10 are much closer than we think, and like battling each other out. I don't think there's one real dominant player from the 3 to 10 ranked players.
Right. But if Alcaraz is who you think he is, he should separate himself out. Right?
And so I think he, like, kind of like Djokovic had that evidence back in 2007, 2006. I think Alcaraz is like kind of like that glimmer of hope, that real like getting those wins, kind of like Djokovic did in 2006 and early 2007, where hopefully Alcaraz learns from this year and makes a next big step next year. Kind of like Djokovic did, like the following year. So I think he's the one most primed out of everyone for the.
I mean, if he got Djokovic again had a pretty friendly draw, maybe it's what Alcaraz needs at the Open, right? Is he needs to get. I mean, Djokovic almost lost to Radek Stepanek. He went to a 5th set tiebreak with him. It's not like he was steamrolling, but again, he was pretty friendly. His last 3 matches: Juan Monaco, Carlos Moya, David Ferrer. Like, that's the modern equivalent of him getting like I don't know, Batista, Gut, Carreño Busta, and then Casper Ruud in the
Yeah.
semis. Like that's a friendly draw versus getting Zverev in the quarters and then Sinner in the fourth round is a tougher draw.
Mhm.
Bilal, last thing before we break,
Mhm.
does watching this match change how you view legacy for Federer and Djokovic at all? Like,
Yeah.
did it remind you of anything? Because you just said it was prime Federer versus 20-year-old Djokovic. It was
Mhm.
closer than you thought.
Mhm.
Does it change and reframe how you think of these guys?
So I think it's interesting because I feel like as somebody who's always acknowledging that, yeah, to me Federer may not be the GOAT anymore, and obviously I'm a big fan and it doesn't change anything for me. I'd say Djokovic and Nadal are more in that category. I still think one thing that you've said in the past too that I think is pretty fair is that it's hard to compare people at their peaks. I think when you look at their peaks is kind of, I think that's a little bit more fair to seeing who is technically the GOAT. But this is peak Federer, and Djokovic is not even close to his peak at this level. And I didn't realize that he was pushing him this heavily. Obviously, like we said before, it's not like Djokovic really established himself right after that Australian Open win in 2008. It took him some time. He had a couple racket changes, coaching issues, stuff like that. He defined his consistency. But I feel like this kind of does cement that Djokovic has always given Federer trouble, and he always was not someone that Federer technically dominated, and always was someone he had under his thumb throughout his career. For example, compared to
Yeah.
like other players that he has, I think this is somebody who he's always had a stylistic weakness against. I think even with this win that was pretty decisive, it still kind of shows that Djokovic was pushing him. So it made me appreciate Federer a little bit more, but also definitely made me appreciate Djokovic too.
Yeah, I wrote a note for myself. I said, I worry. I don't think we ever saw peak Federer and peak Djokovic. I think we saw peak Federer and peak Nadal in some ways at times in terms of how well they played. I think that's why people really loved their rivalry, is we kind of saw them both at their best. And I think they both played awesome matches against each other, Djokovic and Federer. For me, it was more like in my memory, I was like, okay, Federer beat him 07, 08, 09. In his prime, he took care of them. And then once he started declining, he lost in 10 and 11.
Yeah.
And those were both really close matches. He had match points in both of them. He's clearly the better player. And again, margins are slim. But for me, I was watching this and I was just like, if Djokovic just tightens up a couple of things he's going to tighten up once he gets to his prime, this match gets a lot more difficult and tricky for Federer. And it already was difficult for tricky. And like Arjun said, it wasn't a great forehand day, a lot of errors from Federer. But this is like the hard part with tennis, right? Like Federer is in much more flow. He plays, I wrote down, there were a couple of points I wrote down that were ridiculous. There was a second set 4-1 point where Djokovic did a beautiful stretching backhands, open stance, and then hit a drop volley lob combo, just like beautiful construction. But then in the third set, Federer breaks. It's the 15 love point in the last game of the match. And he hits this ridiculous off court, forehand, gets him off court, and then hits the backhand no look like overhead winner. Yeah. I think that I like their matchup actually in some ways stylistically the most of the big three matchup. I think it's the most fun to watch. But I just wondered as I watched it, I was just like, maybe Federer's peak on a hard court just isn't, it's hard to know, like, is he hitting those shots as freely if Djokovic is blocking back these balls and hanging these points a little more? Like is he missing those shots later because he's not as good? Or is he missing those shots later because he's pressing more because he knows Djokovic has more shot tolerance? He's going to hang in these rallies. It's so, like, that's the hard part with tennis. It's so hard to separate the mental part of it. Is part of it, like you said, is Federer a choker as he gets older, or is he just not as confident because he knows he can't do what he did when he was younger? Yeah. And I go back to their Montreal match, which wasn't in this watch, but they talked about it. Federer was up 40 love, 6-5 in that Montreal match in the first set. And he got broken and he lost the set. And we talked about this when we talked about 40-15s, the infamous 40-15s. How could Federer blow it? It's really hard to talk about blowing it when you're playing the greatest returner in the history of the game. Those aren't points where your ratio of winning is 80-20 to start the point. Yeah. With Djokovic returning, the ratio winning each point is closer to 50-50. And so, like, are these guys choking? Is Kyrgios choking at 40 love at Wimbledon? Or is it just, again, you're playing Djokovic? It doesn't matter if you're up 40 love. Things are kind of even because he's probably going to get the ball back and pretty deep. And so, again, I have more begrudging respect for Djokovic after this match. And it worried me a little bit about my whole prime Federer beat top trumps all assessment. I think stylistically he's the most fun to watch. He seems the most unplayable. I think on a given day, if his backhand is flowing down the line, he's not losing to anyone. I also think if they played 10 matches and it averaged out the results, I'm not sure what the result is, but it's not as clear cut to me, Arjun, anymore that Federer is clearly better in his prime.
Yeah, I sadly have to give Djokovic a little more respect now. He really pushed Federer this match. But this was the match was on his racket here in this tournament. This tournament was on his racket. He lost the first set and the second set more than Federer won it. I mean, Federer played great and crawled back, and but he deserves the trophy. But Federer won the third set more than Djokovic lost it, in my opinion. I think that of course it came down to experience, but talking about like legacy for those three players, the big three, like Bilal said, we can't compare the peaks of each one because they were kind of like overlapping, but also not overlapping. It was like that bell-shaped curve that one was rising while the other was like still at their peak, and one was downfalling while the other was rising at their peak. So it's really tough. But I think it's you can compare their mentality and their work ethic, and their work ethic. Each of them was like 150% at all times. And so would Federer still be as good as he was between 2010 and 2020 as he was from 2004 2007 if you put his peak over there? Would there be more matches lost by him, and would he have less slams? Is I think the greatest of these players really comes down to how they adapted to their field, and Djokovic really adapted and made him a star between 2012 to 2016, and even now he adapted the most out of all of them. But Nadal had the biggest longevity, but Nadal's work ethic. Let's take like Rod Laver for example in the 1960s. Like he's clearly not better than any of these players, but his work ethic was like incredible for that at that time period. And you put him in this like era, his work ethic is gonna probably be much better than a lot of these players right now.
Rod Laver is tough because Rod Laver was like 5'8", so it's like he's always the tough one for me because it's just like physically. That's why era comparison's so hard. It's like
that too. But I
Rod Laver is effective if he's playing with a poly, racket. He's not with these new rackets. He's gonna get blown off the court versus if playing with wooden rackets. He can sort of outfox people more like the women's game.
That's fine. I mean, maybe in this day and age, maybe his nutrition would have been better. He would have worked out more. Maybe he could have been
grown taller,
couple inches taller. So again, that's really hard to predict. But like just someone like him with that work ethic playing in 2022, he would probably be top 5, top 10.
Your point is the great ones are going to be great no matter where you
no matter what. Yeah, and it's just really hard to compare era versus era.
Bilal, I'm curious, back to just final thoughts on Federer and Djokovic and just what you took from this. Like, do you feel like we just said he's a once in a generation talent? We don't really see anything like this. Youngest finalist since Pete Sampras. Like all the signs were there. But then you listen to the quotes after the match. I went and looked at like the articles about this. They were all just like very much about Federer, right? Like it was all about Federer, won his 12th. How many can you get? And there's a great quote in the article on ESPN where they say, do you think Djokovic will challenge Rafa for number 2? And he's like, honestly, it doesn't matter who's number 2 and number 3. All that matters is who's number 1.
I read that, yeah.
And it's such a funny, like, prime Federer, sort of arrogant, but not really arrogant because he's telling the truth, very honest kind of assessment. Do you think it was, going back to Arjun's nature versus nurture kind of argument, do you think it was detrimental to Federer that he was in front of those two guys, not just age-wise, but he was always the one ahead? Like, do you think there's something extra about being the hunter? Like, because Nadal and Djokovic were always hunting. They were always chasing. And I wonder if that also fueled them to keep going to the lengths they have. Versus Federer just literally just ran out of time at some point, right? But maybe I'm not saying he won a lot in his prime, but I wonder if when he's 20 and 19 trying to figure it out, if there's a very clear dominant guy ahead of him. Because he was kind of in that interim period where like Sampras was on the way out and there was no one really saying, I'm the guy. Does he figure it out sooner? Does he get that fire in the belly? It's just hard to know if he's at a little bit of a disadvantage because he's always sort of so above these guys before he knows that they've caught up and passed them.
Yeah, I mean, you can make that argument. I think it's fair, but at the same time, I think he also got extra mileage out of his career because he saw that these guys are around. I think definitely there's an element to them that pushed him to adapt his game, stay in the game a little bit longer. Who knows if he would have stayed in the game this long? I mean, I'm sure he would have. He seems pretty passionate about tennis overall, and doesn't look like he would have left the game any earlier than he had, and he hasn't even left yet. But that being said, I think there is some benefit to being the person who's hunting, because I think it kind of gives you that ambition, like you said, gives you that hunger to kind of, I think that's what actually benefited Djokovic the most. That he saw these two guys are so dominant. What can I do? In a way, Djokovic is, I think, in a way, early in his career, he annoyed a lot of people because this guy has so much self belief. I think it turned me off as a fan. I mean, I'm not a huge Djokovic fan,
but maybe you have to have that self belief.
Exactly.
Like he said, they quote him, said he said from the time he's a kid, like, I want to be number one in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's annoying to hear that, but maybe that's what you need. You have to have a little bit of rational, like, hey, I'm going to be the best. How often do you feel like these guys really believe it?
Exactly.
That takes me back to the cringeworthy moment LeBron James called himself the best player in the world when he was down a few games in the playoffs.
But he was right.
Yeah, he was right. So
the other final point, the crowd was pro Djokovic here, which is probably the last time in any match at the US Open or anywhere that Djokovic was being rooted for over Federer. And this was the peak of sort of Federer fatigue, where there wasn't nostalgia and people were just like, we just want someone else to win, maybe. Yeah. And Djokovic hadn't really ticked off the New York crowd the way he would a year later with that Roddick interview. So anyway, we'll wrap here. That was our first rewatchable classic match. Thanks for joining me for this, Bilal and Arjun and the whole team. We'll come back with another match. We'll think about maybe another US Open match, maybe in a couple of weeks we'll come back. And then also when we get close to the Open, the draw. So thanks again, guys.
Sounds good. Thanks.
See ya.